Hello again, I am Blunty, and while poking around looking for a little extra information, I wanted to nail down about the Pro Controller 2 and the Joy-Con charging grip for the Nintendo Switch 2, I stumbled across a couple of very interesting reveals that were kind of buried in places where most people aren't going to go looking. The second thing I found accidentally was quite a surprising reveal indeed. Because, as I'm sure we all know, the Switch 2 is nearly fully backwards compatible with almost every Switch 1 game ever released. But they're not doing this backwards compatibility like Nintendo have always handled generational backwards compatibility. They're kind of actually emulating the original Switch on the Switch 2. Now, it is not quite emulation. Instead, it's something a little more nuanced and, frankly, quite a lot more clever. But the less tech-savvy among you are more familiar with the word emulator, so we'll start with that for a frame of reference. But just quickly, before we bite into that big meal of reveals, this is not something big enough, I think, for a video on its own, at least not how I make videos, but I still want to note it because it's a very cool thing and very, very Nintendo. So the first thing I found when I went looking for extra info on the Pro Controller 2 and the Joy-Con charging grip was the fact that the Pro Controller 2's form factor was, I was delighted to discover, in fact influenced by the GameCube controller. Specifically, the shape and profile of the grip lobes were reshaped for a better grip inspired by the GameCube controller, which, as I said before, I still consider the official wireless GameCube controller, the Wavebird, one of the best controllers ever made. I still have my original one and it still works like it's fresh out of the box. So I'm pretty chuffed with that little fact. But that is not the best thing. That's not what I wanted to tell you about. That's just a side note. So, those back buttons. It's the first time Nintendo has included programmable custom buttons on the controllers, and the first time a company's default standard controller option has had such a thing. Both Xbox and PlayStation, of course, have options that have these things, but they're premium models, not the standard ones. So that's pretty neat. I never used to like back buttons or paddles that much, but I've grown to like them as more and more third-party controller designs have refined the idea of them. Now I use them very frequently indeed. And this flat, flush fit style of button is indeed my personal preference for back buttons. Not a big fan of the paddles. But that's not the best thing either. That's another side note. The cool thing I wanted to highlight for you is these new buttons, labeled GL and GR, presumably for grip left and grip right, which you will also find on the Joy-Con 2 charging grip accessory. When you assign custom inputs to them, these assigned button inputs are actually saved for each individual game automatically, as well as each separate player account. So if two of you share the same Switch and you've got different accounts and you play the same game, the controller will remember who is using that controller and automatically assign your personal custom profile for those back buttons, which is a really nice way to do that. Because obviously in many games you'll want different things assigned to those shortcuts, and while many third-party controllers with back buttons do this by having like 3 or 5 profiles you can swap between with a button press, if you remember which profile you assigned to which game and remember which blinking LED color means you're in which profile and what that means for which game you're playing and such, it's not a great system. I never really use that on the other controllers. I just reassign them when I need them manually. But Nintendo were like, nah, we can do better than that. They just automatically save that for each game in its own setup profile and automatically switch to it whenever you start that particular game, which is so nice. And also confirmed, and this is the bit I actually went looking for, what functions you can assign to those back buttons is not limited to just stuff like, the D-pad or the face button inputs, like it so often is. If you want to make one of these buttons act like the capture button, for instance, you can do that, meaning you can now pop a screenie or save a video clip without even lifting off from the left thumbstick and whatever you're doing in game. That is going to make certain kinds of split-second action shots way easier, and it means saving a video clip without breaking action and getting yourself shot in the face or something way more practical. That's something I often struggle with on the Switch, and it only takes a moment where you lift off the stick and you press the button to do the video clip and you're back on the stick and you've lost control of the game for a second. Now, well, there's a solution for that. So yeah, I'm very excited by that, but the most interesting thing, and the reason I made this video, and the reason I started out by teasing this information, I stumbled across this in the same place I found that controller information, and it was how backwards compatibility works. See, we're all pretty familiar with how Nintendo really likes to support at least one generation of backwards compatibility whenever they can make that practical. And they've basically always done that by literally simply including the core hardware from the old systems into the new ones, especially with their handhelds. GBA could play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games because it had the Game Boy hardware in it. The Nintendo DS could play GB, GBC, GBA games because it had the hardware in it. The Nintendo 3DS could play DS games because it had the DS hardware in it. So everything just ran natively, just fine, exactly as it would on the original consoles because, well, it effectively was. The Wii U didn't do that, but it did a very similar thing with its backwards compatibility to the Wii games, because the Wii U's CPU was basically just a juiced up version of the Wii's, meaning it was, in the parlance of nerdery, perfectly binary compatible. Same architecture down to the bone, just faster and with some extra bells and whistles. So all they had to do to make Wii games work on the Wii U was shut down a couple of the CPU cores and hunk down the clock speed to match what the Wii originally ran at, and bam, it was basically just a Wii. A very similar thing went on with the GameCube compatibility on the Wii itself. There used to be a joke going around that the Wii was nothing more than two GameCubes duct taped together, which is actually not too far from the truth. And it's also why if you jailbroke your Wii U, you could play GameCube games natively, because it was effectively just a juiced up version of the Wii hardware, which itself was a juiced up version of the GameCube hardware, so all you had to do was adjust how fast the CPU ran, and you had native compatibility all the way down. The GameCube itself, of course, it did not have backwards compatibility. Not only was it a different architecture completely than the Nintendo 64, but of course, carts versus discs, so they didn't really bother fiddling with that. However, the Switch 2 does not contain any original Switch hardware. They redesigned the thing from the ground up, even if on the outside it looks very, very similar. And this information, by the way, I think I've neglected to mention it so far, but it is from the official Nintendo site. This is not some third-party investigation, from a hardware teardown or something. This is what Nintendo themselves are publishing. It's buried away in a series of blog posts that are in fact interviews with the actual hardware development teams. And in those, they reveal things like when they started Switch 2 development, the focus was on enhancing its performance as hardware, namely expanding its capability, and backwards compatibility was a much lower priority than it had been in previous generations of hardware development. And because of the approach to the hardware design, it was difficult to achieve the same level of backwards compatibility with the Switch 2 that a lot of the older generation hardware achieved very, very easily. So, in basic terms, it means the Switch and Switch 2 are not, in fact, compatible at a hardware level. They are not binary compatible. The Switch 2 cannot just simply natively run Switch 1 game code. So they literally can't just shut down some cores or downclock it and run native previous generation games like how they did with the Wii and the Wii U. To work around this hardware limitation, but still maintain backwards compatibility, which is important to them, they would have to go a different way. In the blog post, the developers talk about how if we tried to use technology like software emulators, we'd have to run Switch 2 at full capacity, and that would mean the battery wouldn't last so long. So they did test just full-on emulation, and it seems like that could have worked, but because emulation is just inefficient by its nature, needing a much more powerful processor than what the emulator is actually simulating, it seems that the power and heat and battery requirements to do so on the Switch 2 ruled that out as a practical solution. So instead, what they've done, in their own words, or at least in their own words officially translated from Japanese, something that is somewhere in between a software emulator and hardware compatibility. This is getting a bit technical, they continue, but the process of converting game data for Switch to run on Switch 2 is performed on a real-time basis as the data is read in. So, for those of you who are not super big nerds about this stuff, what that is describing is what we call a translation layer. It is very much like how the Linux-based Steam Deck can seamlessly run games designed only to run on Windows. It uses a translation layer, which Valve brands Proton. Although in that particular case, Windows and SteamOS run on the same hardware architecture, so the automatic real-time translation stuff is all to do with the software side of things. Basically taking what the game is asking for from Windows native language and its, binaries and libraries and stuff, and just translating that on the fly to something Linux understands for its libraries and binaries and stuff. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's a near enough metaphor to make the point. So the Switch 2 is doing a similar thing, but with software and hardware calls. Because while the Switch 2's CPU and GPU might not be directly fully binary compatible, they do still share some common architecture, both being ARM CPU based and both using NVIDIA's GPU architectures. So it is not a full emulation again. They're not simulating the entirety of the Switch 1's hardware in software like we do when emulating retro games on our PCs or something. Instead, they're being real-time translated to the Switch 2's hardware and software calls, but doing it like this also means it won't be perfect. There will, and indeed already are, some problem games. But this, like what happens with the Steam Deck and the Windows games, can be rectified and fixed over time with patches and updates and such. But it is still an issue that will occasionally crop up on us. But the benefits of doing it like this, though, is you can still do things like use the Switch 2's unique features alongside of it. Like the new game chat stuff, for example, the screen sharing, the camera feeds, the voice chat, all of that will just work and work perfectly even while you're running a Switch 1 game. And it works because you're not pushing the Switch 2 down into a slower mode for hardware level backwards compatibility. You're not turning off cores, you're not downclocking, and you're not doing things like loading up the Switch 1's operating system for compatibility. It's menus, it's BIOS stuff, things that hardware level compatibility and pure emulation would both need to approach. And because it's not downclocked and nerfed with core shutdowns and whatnot, like the Wii and the Wii U did, that also means you get automatic benefits like much faster loading times and more stable performance because you have more CPU and GPU overhead because it is running in its native speed mode. So, while there are indeed a couple of drawbacks that should be relatively rare and affect very few games, there's also some pretty sweet benefits to this approach. And while on paper the instinct might be, well, I just wish it had hardware native compatibility because that would just make things easy and it would be seamless and it would be perfect all the time, I think this is actually a genuinely better approach because of those extra benefits we get. So yeah, I hope you find this as interesting as I do. I look forward to seeing what other nice little tricks they can do with this approach to backwards compatibility, piping it through a translation layer instead. So thanks for watching. I am Blunty. Thank you as always to the patrons, and I will catch you next time.